They wanted me to talk about demographic changes and trends for the future, what the economy is going to look like, the role of housing. They wanted me to talk about issues about splits between city and suburb and affordable housing. They wanted me to be inspirational and emotional. They suggested that I might want to give a prediction of your particular housing market, including person-by-person predictions of your housing values. I was also asked to address the situation in Crimea and whether or not there'd be a way to get Putin to back off. And finally, I was kind of surprised in the way in. I was really asked, I can't believe this request, that I would talk about whether or not Dr. Karl Rove, now that he's made his newfound medical diagnosis of brain damage for Hillary Clinton, might shift his attention to someone who truly has brain damage, Donald Sterling. So, zing! I'm a Clippers fan, but not of that guy. So that's a lot to do in what we in Spanish call a keynotito, a short keynote. So what I'm instead going to do is to talk a little bit about the demographic changes, a little bit about the economy, and then a little bit about what the relationship is to housing, but also how housing is got the work that you're doing is kind of bigger connection to the American dream, and that's where I will end. So I'll get started. I always like to tell audiences before I get started, while I'm speaking, my voice might break a little bit. It's not that I'm emotional being with you, although really it's the highlight of my week. It's that I have a speech condition, speech disorder, that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. It's something that Diane Rehm of NPR has, Robert Kennedy Jr. has, so that can happen while I'm talking. And I always like to assure audiences, don't worry, it gets treated once a month with Botox, believe it or not, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So, so for some of you, the happiest day of the year might be your birthday or Hanukkah or maybe the Champions of Housing conference, I don't know. But for someone like me, the happiest day of the year is the day that the census releases its statistics. And so when the census released its last statistics, there were some remarkable things, and I'll talk a little bit about how they apply in your particular region. But nationally, what we found was that the growth rate over the previous decade, between 2000 and 2010 for Latinos, was 43% increase. The increase for Asian Pacific Islanders, 43%. For African Americans, 11%. For non-Hispanic whites in the country, 1%. So 43%, 1%, that's a big difference. And it's part of the reason why on the night that President Obama won re-election with only 39% of the white vote, and commentators in the news were going, oh my God, the country's changing, the country's changing. I kept thinking, where were you for the last few years when I was giving speeches around the country about these changes and the things that they might mean? Now, one of the really interesting things about that statistic, and we'll kind of bring it home here in a second, is that when most people hear, in particular, those growth rates, the 43% for Latinos to 43% for Asians, they tend to think that what's driving it is immigration, right? And the interesting thing is that's no longer true. Immigration into the country has stabilized over the last 4 years. The shift in immigration has been such that now there are more immigrants coming from Asia than coming from Latin America. And in fact, our biggest sending country, Mexico, has net migration of 0. There's as many Mexicans returning to Mexico as are coming into the United States. And that big shift has not simply been a function of increased border enforcement or a slower US economy, but more fundamentally of the economies in Latin America and Asia doing better, and even more fundamentally, a change in fertility in Mexico. It used to be over the course of her lifetime, a Mexican woman would have 5 children. That's about 35 years ago. The fertility rate in Mexico is now 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. As those come together, what's happening is there's not as much of an immigration push, and that growth rate is fundamentally coming from children. So in the last 10 years, for example, the number of young non-Hispanic whites under the age of 18, actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News. It would have been blamed on Obamacare. So, and don't worry, I'll make fun of Rachel Maddow later. So what it does mean is that the number of people moving into 19 and 20 is much more than the number of people moving into 1 and 2, so the net number declines. Number of young African Americans in the country actually fell by about 250,000. Some of that redesignation into the multiracial category. The number of young Latinos by 4.8 million went up, and the number of young Asian Pacific Islanders by about 800,000. So that's the next America. The next America are really the children of these immigrants moving forward. And what that means is that when people predict what's going to happen in the United States, the prediction now is that the US will be majority minority, or majority people of color, by about the year 2042, 2043. So not too far away, and in fact, 10 years before that, the majority of the workforce will be people of color, and about 12 years before that, the majority of youth will be people of color. So that's kind of where we're headed. And what's interesting about your location, Bridgeport, Stamford, Norwalk, the metropolitan area, is that you'll get there first. You were actually in 1980 whiter than the rest of the country. You'll become majority people of color by about 2026, according to the projections from the US Census. So that's a remarkable set of changes. Now, they're of course not as much as we've had in California, although in California we're sort of slowing down in some really important ways. In California, the demographic change that's going to occur in the United States between 2000 and 2050, that's roughly what California went through between 1980 and 2000. California is kind of America fast forward. And it's important to kind of think about what those changes are going to mean. There's another aspect of this change which I think is important. There's a couple of different aspects. One is the geography. And one of the things I think that's incredibly interesting about the demographic change is, again, a lot of it happened initially in California. But here's what's interesting. In the last 10 years, what do you think is the only large metro area in the United States? New York, Hartford, Atlanta, Denver. What do you think is the only large metro area in the United States that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? Detroit? Not correct. Not correct. Los Angeles. Because Los Angeles's demographic changes are starting to stabilize, right? As many white people who are going to move out already moved out, and the Latino population is getting older, the immigrant population is getting older, having less kids, et cetera, and the population is stabilizing in California. Why that's important is because when people think about that demographic change occurring in the United States, they think, oh my God, it's all going to happen in California, right? California is going to become 150% minority. Super Latinos walking the streets, right? Counting for more than one. But really what's going on is it's a change that's happening all over the country. It's happening through the South, it's happening now in parts of the Midwest, certainly in large parts of the West, and happening here as well, as I mentioned. And the interesting thing about it, when you go below what's happening in the country as a whole, is that the demographic change is occurring most rapidly in America's suburbs. It used to be when we thought about these changes happening, these were changes that would happen in the central city. But in fact, it's the suburbs where the demographic change is occurring the most rapidly and most dramatically. It's also where pockets of poverty are increasing. And what's important about that is these are the areas that are not really prepared for those demographic changes, for the shifts in population. They don't have the social services infrastructure, they don't have the civic infrastructure, and they often don't have the community organizing infrastructure, which is the infrastructure that helps to lift up the issues of low-income people, of new immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. That's why it's really important that you have this affordable housing network that's trying to make sure that every place in your metropolitan area is taking some fair share of the affordable housing that needs to be there, because those are the populations that are changing and moving forward. So those are big demographic changes. The other thing which I think is kind of interesting, I would say about your area, which I think is really important, is that you're actually quite immigrant. You're twice as immigrant as the country as a whole, which is really interesting. And you got there, you were about as immigrant as the country, 4% foreign born in 1980. You've had a big increase in that population. That's probably a lot of your Latino and some of your Asian population. But it'll probably stabilize, as I'm mentioning. So, question. That demography, interesting stuff? Okay. None of that is as interesting as the following statistic that came out from the census. It has to do with the age structure of the populations. It turns out that the median age, half older, half younger, for non-Hispanic whites in the country is 42 years. In your metro, it's 43, half older, half younger. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders, about 35. The median age for African Americans, 32. The median age for Latinos, 27. 42, 27, in your case 43, 27. That's 15 years, that's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One, it helps to explain our demographic change, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may be, Godspeed. You might want to consider a sports car too, but the second thing is that it helps to explain some of our politics, and our politics in which an older generation sometimes doesn't see itself in a younger generation. So to think about that, what state in the United States do you think has the biggest generation gap, the whitest old, the brownest young? Iowa. Good guess, wrong. Florida, wrong. Texas, not quite. Arizona. And think about the politics in Arizona with regard to immigration reform, ethnic studies in the schools. And here's another really interesting statistic about Arizona. And it correlates all over the country, which is in the last 5 years, Arizona had the third largest per student cuts in K through 12 spending. Arizona had the largest decrease in university spending and the largest increase in tuition. That is, and by the way, that holds up across the country. If you look at the generation gap and you look at the spending, there are exceptions. But basically, when an older generation doesn't see itself in a younger generation, you wind up getting cuts in infrastructure spending, et cetera. And one of the, we need to address that level of disconnection. Housing, organizing is all part of it. And one of the reasons why this is important, one other demographic fact, and then some economy and then a conclusion, which is the following. It used to be that you could talk about an age pyramid. That is a lot of young people, and then as you go up through the age structure, you get to the point where most of us pass on. But it turns out that in 1945, 1950, the US had a classic age pyramid. Lots of young people, not as many older folks. As you look at this going over time, particularly as the baby boomers got born and come up, that age pyramid in the United States by 2060 is an age cylinder. That is a very small number of young people that'll be roughly equivalent to the number of old people. And what's interesting about that, a thing called the dependency ratio, basically if you're working, how many folks may you be supporting in terms of Medicare and Social Security, et cetera, that age dependency ratio is projected to increase by about 60%. So what that means is a young generation actually needs to be more productive than even we were in order to have a healthy and productive society moving forward. So how are we doing in that field? Not that well. We have a huge set of crises in the United States with regard to inequality and a lack of opportunity that has a general character to it, and it also has a racial character to it. By the way, what do you think is the best-selling book in the United States right now? Capital. Who's heard of that book? Okay. Who's read that book? Excellent. That's good. There'll be a quiz after my talk. So Capital is a 776-page book about the economy by a French economist. And it reads like it was written by a French economist, right? It's kind of badly translated. You're trying to figure things out. But what it does is it's the most careful documentation, along with Emmanuel Size from Berkeley and Raj Chetty from Harvard, of what's been going on in terms of inequality in the United States and other advanced capitalist countries. And we are now at a level of inequality in the United States which is higher than it was in the 1920s. And in fact, the two big peaks at our inequality were, for the share going to the top 1%, were 1928, the year before the Great Depression, 2007, the year before the Great Recession, but we've gone back up to that level of inequality. And you know, Bridgeport, Stanford, I'm proud to say you're leading the pack. That is a standard measure of income inequality called the Gini coefficient. What went up by about 18% in the country in the last 30 years, and in this metro area went up by 36%. That is twice the increase in inequality in this metropolitan area as in the rest of the country. And there's growing concern about this level of inequality for a couple of different reasons. One is that we've always been able to tell ourselves the following thing. We might be kind of unequal as a country, like some folks do really well at the top, but you know, most people do okay, and there's mobility in the country, right? That you can start at the bottom, but you can work your way up to the top, right? That's what we tell ourselves. And there's a couple things about that that are not working any longer. Number one, the median wage and median household income levels have actually been flat and declining. There's been a growing gap, not just between the top 1% and everybody else, but between those who are pretty skilled at the 90th percentile and those who are like the 25th percentile. But more than that, we are less mobile, meaning the probability of somebody who's born in the bottom fifth of the income distribution winding up in the top fifth of the income distribution. The only other country that's less mobile than us, of an advanced capitalist country, is England. And we like had a revolution because we didn't like them, right? Sweden has more class mobility than we do. Germany, versus almost every, the only other countries that look like us are Argentina and Brazil in terms of a lack of class mobility. So and there's a pretty high correlation. If you draw a graph, the level of inequality and the lack of mobility go hand in hand. So the story we've been telling ourselves, right, which is, oh, well, we're unequal, but at least people are mobile, it's not a good story. The other story we've been telling ourselves, and this gets to why it's important to the work that you're doing, is that, well, you know, inequality, somebody might not like it for moral reasons or political reasons or such, but inequality must be essential for economic growth. That is the argument that if we have more income at the top of the income distribution, there's going to be more savings and investment, there's going to be more incentives for people to work harder. Martin Feldstein was writing exactly this in the Wall Street Journal this morning, attacking Piketty's book. Here's what's interesting about that. For the last 30 years, researchers working in the developing world have been looking at the relationship between income inequality and economic growth, and they're finding that there's a negative relationship. The more economic inequality you've got, the less growth you get. And last year, the International Monetary Fund did a study looking at the relationship between inequality, between a lot of factors, and what were predict the length of growth most important factor limiting growth in the long run was income inequality. And essentially the argument goes that if you've got a lot of income inequality, people aren't making the basic investments in public education, public investments. There's a lot of division within the society, so it's hard to come up with a growth strategy, et cetera. And so for about the last 10 years, I and a bunch of other people have been doing this with America's metropolitan areas. And we find the same results. When you look at America's metropolitan areas and their economic growth, what you find is that those places that are more unequal, more residentially segregated, and more sort of fragmented politically, turn out not to have sustainable growth over time. And I always like to tell people, I know you're looking at me, you're thinking, I don't know, man. He's a professor from California. He probably came up with that idea in a hot tub, right? He dropped his laptop in and out came these results and he's making a big deal about it. So don't believe me. Believe that well-known left-leaning organization, the Cleveland Federal Reserve, which did a study for Fund for Our Economic Future, which is a group of philanthropists and business people try to revitalize Northeast Ohio, and they tried to find out what predicted economic growth, and they looked at it and they found things that you would expect: anchor university, diversified industrial structure, skills in the population. But much to their surprise, they found that 3 factors that really limited growth in the long haul were income inequality, residential segregation, and big splits between cities and suburbs in terms of poverty. That is when poverty is really concentrated in one area. So there is a new message emerging here that not only is inequality something that we might want to deal with for reasons that have to do with our sense of fairness, but it's really related to whether or not we've got mobility, and it's actually related to economic growth, and it's more critical than ever given the changing demography and who it is that are going to be the workers of the future. And here are, in particular in your area, you've got some challenging statistics. So your dropout rate for Latinos is about 5 times what it is for non-Hispanic whites in the area here. And you've also got a very highly educated white and Asian population, but not a well-educated African American and Latino population. If you churn that through into the future, you get an economy that's not going to be working, and this is something that's beginning to emerge as a really important thing to pay attention to. So I'm going to try to bring this to a close by talking about the role of housing, but before I do, if you're interested in what I just said, you can buy my book, which we put out last year. It's called Just Growth. And the idea, it's a great title, which is that some people think growth alone will solve all problems. All you need is just growth. We think you need just growth. That is, you need growth that's intentional about equity and opportunity. So it's a great book, well written, available on Amazon.com. And if you're not a big reader, don't worry, it's about to be made into a major motion picture in which I'm going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. So I'm really so excited. So with this changing demography, with this idea that we really have to generate opportunity in the economy for everyone, and in particular because if we want the economy to work in the future, we have to make sure that everyone's a part of it. How does housing fit in? How does the American dream fit in? To me, housing is critical, and what you're doing is critical for at least 4 different reasons. One is housing is critical to connecting people to employment and services. So one of the things that's going on is that a lot of the jobs that people can take, that is skilled jobs that don't require many skills, are actually now in suburbs where it's hard to find housing. And so that's one of the reasons why the diversity is going on. So getting the housing in place to connect people to employment and services is critical. Housing is critical because it connects people to particular kinds of educational institutions, schools, that can help their children to succeed or not. Housing is super critical to wealth acquisition. It's the single most important way of people accumulating wealth who are working class and middle class, and it's incredibly important for African Americans and Latinos. If you look at the difference between white wealth and Black and Latino wealth, white wealth is often much more diversified because it's been more generational, and so there'll be sort of equity and stocks and stuff like that. For most African Americans and Latinos who've just made it into the middle class, the main source of wealth holding is their house. And so it's very, very critical for the advancement of that. And of course, one thing people don't think about with housing, but it seems like you are here, is housing is critical to reconnecting community. When you get a mixed income project, right, that is done so well as some of the ones that you've done, and people begin to see that you can have poor people who live amongst you, and it will be okay, right? You can have disabled or senior or people who need help, and it becomes critical to connecting us because it's that generational disconnection, that disconnection between communities that's been really critical to the sort of disillusion of the sense of a national identity and a national fortune. And this is important because as we are moving forward, what's at stake is not simply our immediate economy. What's at stake is whether or not we make sure that the American dream is accessible to a next generation, that the American dream can be realized by another group as well. When I think of the American dream, and I think about how it is that we're going to make sure that it once again becomes what captures our imagination and is really a reality for people, I tend to think of my story, which, like many sons of immigrants, actually begins a generation before. My dad arrived in the country in the 1930s with papers that were imperfect. When World War II came, he was given a choice between being deported or joining the U.S. Army. And he couldn't figure out what to do. So he gave a penny to my cousin Carlitos, who flipped it. That literally is what happened. And my dad and that penny went to the war. Both came back safe. He met and married my mom, who'd grown up in Spanish Harlem. And a generation later, his son is a full professor at the University of Southern California. And what I like to tell people and leave them with is that that's a great story, right? It's an American story. And it's the wrong story. It's the wrong story because when you tell it that way, what it sounds like is an individual family and their desires and hard work, what we say in Spanish, their ganas, to get ahead. And my dad had that, my mom had that, I had that. But there's another part of the story. In the 1930s, when my dad had no papers, he had a union which protected his rights at work. And when he came back from the war, there was a GI Bill. And the GI Bill meant two things. One is that he could go with a 6th grade education to a community college in the heart of downtown Los Angeles and learn about electricity and go from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman. And our family went from being poor to being working class. And with the GI Bill, he was able to buy a house in a suburb of Los Angeles, La Puente, and finance it. And we were able to grow up there in a place that had decent public schools because people were investing in them. And when time came to go to college, there was affirmative action for a kid like me that did not fit the typical profile of who was going to college at the time. And that, I will submit to you, is the American dream. It is a story. It is a story about families and individuals, because we all need to step up. But it's also a story of the structures and policies that we put in place to make it possible for people to succeed, the housing policies, the housing platforms. And it's also a story of the social movements that put those policies in place. The labor movement that brought us unions, the veterans movement, there was one that made sure that there were benefits, the civil rights movement that made sure that racially restrictive covenants got lifted so folks like me could move out to the suburbs and that there would be affirmative action. It's a story of individuals, it's a story of policies, and it's a story of movements. So make sure that as we reconstruct what we think is really the hope for everyone in the United States, an American dream that's realized by all, that we are building a movement, the kind of movement that you're celebrating today, to connect people, to connect generations, to make housing just one part of the next America.